and was asked by my son, Nicholas Harwood Van Vachter, who's been helping me with this, execute this YouTube video about my activities in the civil rights movement. And I had the great good fortune to be brought to the AME Zion African American Episcopal Zion Church in Knoxville, Tennessee, by Esther Hartfield, who had worked for my mother and been a member of this congregation. The preacher was a wonderful man named G.J. Hill. He had grown up in Philadelphia. His father had made money in the real estate in Philadelphia. He was one of my best friends ever, a great preacher, great sense of humor, and he took great care in introducing me to, taking me to first a Congress of Ministers down in south of Knoxville, near Georgia, in Chattanooga, where a lot of black ministers were meeting. We drove down in his powder blue four-door Cadillac sedan with a kind of nubbly roof, and he lived well. And the first time I went to his house next to the church, his lovely wife, wonderful lady who was teaching school over in North Carolina, near Goldberg, near where the lunch counters sit-ins had taken place. And they had a wonderful cold supper with turkey and cranberry sauce and potato salad and a wonderful, wonderful sort of cold supper after Thanksgiving dinner, a few days afterwards. And we got acquainted, and then Reverend Hill would invite me over after his workday was finished, and I started coming to the church on Sundays. And I'll tell you, if you ever the strength of your faith in the Lord weakens, go to African American church where they sing their gospel, and the ministers gave these rousing, hugely moving sermons, bombastic, with extraordinary improvisation around the themes, not like holy rollers, but in fact, I was invited to preach at the church because I was getting interested in becoming an Episcopal minister and going to Harvard Divinity School. And I gave a sermon at Reverend Hill's church, and one of the members said, "Well, I didn't really feel the build-up." In fact, in a book I had, which is called "The Discipline of the AME Zion Church," they talked about the build-up of sermons, when it becomes really inspiring, and this great care is taken and shaping the sermon, so it's a great oratorical and moving emotional experience. And the churches, the members throughout the sermon are really keeping this dialogue going, encouraging the minister, saying, "Tell it, Reverend, tell it. Yes, yes," and responding with a sense and saying, "Yes, yes," and I mean, it gets very, very inspiring and a hugely emotional experience. And people sometimes cry, and they're asked to renew their faith. It's a real like a one of these great rituals of renewal and being reborn. They're asked to come up by the pastor to the front of the church and put and they come up and they come up around the altar where or the part of the church where the gospel is read and the sermon is given, and the pastor comes to them and puts his hands on their head. It's really laying on of hands and welcomes welcomes them into the renewal of their faith. And all this time, the gospel choir is singing this wonderful, wonderful gospel, and your faith will come back. I remember. The chills going down my back. Just so inspired. Wonderful people in this church, beautiful younger women, and one of the oldest people in the church was about 88 years old. He was a deacon, and actually I did a video of him on Cambridge TV, talking with him about his whole life and his role in the church. And this is about the time that I, after reading the 23rd chapter of St. John, when Jesus says, "Feed my lambs, feed my sheep," I saw that it was going to be my calling to be involved in the soup kitchen that was being held at this AME Zion Church. And there was another man cooking there named Cooper. And I did the cooking for these dinners, which were Friday evenings and Monday evenings. And Reverend Howard McClendon encouraged me. He told me that there had been, they had 25 people. There had been about 100 people, and then it thinned out a little bit. Who were really needed were not getting enough, were unable to buy enough food to feed their families. And so 25 people were coming to each of these dinners. So about 125 people were being served dinners. Never asked any questions. Just they wouldn't have to stand in line. They would come in the front door about 6 o'clock, 6:30, Friday or Monday, and take their seats at the table and were served. They wouldn't have to stand in line as you might at a cafeteria, but they were served bread, soup, salad, and a beverage, and a dessert at the end, and often wonderful rice or tuna fish salad, salads, rice salads, and bread and beverage, and I helped the members of the congregation did the serving. Cooper cooked, I cooked, and Reverend Howard McClendon cooked. And there was a wonderful lady named Bee there who sort of officiated and made sure everything went well. Everybody was welcomed, and they're getting what they needed. And it was just a glorious occasion. And this older man, who's about 88 years old, was one of the main people who made this wonderful church supper happen in their fellowship hall. And so I started raising money for it. I went down to the foundation downtown at the foundation library, got a book, and all the foundations in Boston, like the Himes Foundation, and also the Trinity Church was giving money, and I would write out drafts of these letters and read carefully the guidelines of what they were looking for and to whom to address these letters of need, requesting funds for these free suppers that would feed 125 people a week. And there was a lot of poverty in America and in Cambridge at this time. The Salvation Army served lunches and breakfasts, and some of the other churches were involved, like Christ Church in Harvard Square. And I remember a friend of mine, David and Ann Ferry. Ann was a professor of English at Boston College. David and Ann had taught at Wellesley before he was made a full professor there. She'd been teaching at Harvard. I had studied creative writing with her at Harvard. She was a great Milton scholar and Dryden scholar, and ended up teaching at BC. They both taught for a while when he was an assistant professor at Wellesley before he got tenure out there, and had gotten his PhD. He'd gone to Amherst and then studied 18th century literature with Andrew Wanning and at Harvard, and then had a great career teaching at Wellesley. Was a beloved teacher of English there, and even taught a full Shakespeare course from time to time. He became winning the National Book Award for his translations of Horace, published by Farrar, Straus, and Giroux, and he translated Gilgamesh, and that won, I think, a National Book Award also. And he won from the Poetry Foundation in Chicago. He a couple of years ago won $125,000 for his lifetime publications of his original lyric poems. He and Frank Bedard and Robert Pinsky, who was poet laureate, would meet, have a kind of poetry writers group, and give each other criticisms and good ideas about how to make their poems more effective and improve them. And that was hugely important in David's life. I mean, he had told me about this joyfully, and it really worked out for him. I mean, he became very productive. His latest book is called Bewilderment. He's now, I think, in his early 90s, 91, soon to be 95, and lives in Brookline Village in an apartment building in which his daughter Elizabeth and her husband and her sons live. And right next to the Pomodoro restaurant, where he treated us to lunch several times, wouldn't let me pay, said, "This is my territory, this is on me." A fantastic Italian restaurant. I mean, really, one of the best I've ever eaten in anywhere, Italy or Paris or any other place. And so he lives in Brookline Village, and right down the street from that wonderful Irish pub there, where our good friend Teresa Mitchell had done a marvelous dramatization of Penelope's monologue in Ulysses, ending on yes, 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 as she ascends to to the amorous entreaties of her lover, and it's a one long sentence stream of consciousness technique at its absolute most magnificence, a tour de force by Joyce. Teresa did this monologue, and at this pub in Brookline Village years ago, and she sometimes lived in our cupola, and we'd often see her at the Plough and the Stars, and then she went back to Dublin, where she grew up and was educated, and she was in a theater there, given wonderful roles, and unfortunately she later died of cancer. She was an absolutely splendid, very gifted actress. It was some theater that was probably modeled on the Abbey Theater, and she got some wonderful roles there when she went back to Dublin before she died. And sort of a sad event. That was a sad event for us. My wife Patricia and I were very fond of her. In fact, I did a wonderful. She posed for me and another couple of artists who had studios in Somerville. She posed for us nude, and I did a wonderful drawing of her. And she's a wonderful young woman. Teresa Mitchell, bless her soul. May she rest in peace. I wanted to talk a little bit about, when I would talk about what needed to be done about the civil rights movement and getting the schools integrated and voting rights, which Stokely Carmichael was heralding in Alabama. Reverend Hill said, well, where were you at Selma? Where were you at Montgomery? And I said, well, I was in school. He said, that's no excuse. He said, you've got to get involved. And he told me about how he, in the Mississippi Summer and other black ministers, had actually been like some kind of special operations unit carrying, packing a .38 revolver to protect themselves, and it was darn sure that they should have done that. Look what happened to Cheney and Goodman, who got killed by the KKK and buried in some swamp. It was just the most outrageous, horrible murders of these civil rights workers. And then Medgar Evers, blown away. This was a very violent and very, very dangerous time when the courage of people like, there was another man named Buford Posey that George Hill remembered to me, who had been very active around Jackson and Oxford, Mississippi, and very courageous people made this happen. So I realized that I had to make an effort to get moving. And George Hill would tell me about how before the big march at Selma, they would go to here down the hall in the place hotel they were staying. They would hear Reverend Martin Luther King screaming in agony, as if I'm almost asking the Lord to relieve him from this necessity that he'd lead the march. He was very afraid, and had good reason to be, I mean, and not soon after that, of course, he was killed in Memphis, um, to giving uh, addressing the union before James Earl Jones blew him away there, and it was later put in prison near Knoxville. In fact, my good lawyer and friend John Lockridge went with a blonde lawyer, female lawyer who interviewed him at I think it was called Stony Mountain Prison. This was I don't know who had influenced this murderer to assassinate the greatest leader of the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King. I read all his books. A letter from jail, and finally King would come out of his room, go to the head of the march, and when he was given an honorary degree at Bard College, my wife was there present, and there was a big rainstorm, and he accompanied her down the hill back walking toward her after he received this honorary doctorate degree. You know, he got his PhD in philosophy at Boston University, with majoring in his subject was Hegel. He wrote his dissertation on Hegel, and it very much shows up in the structure of his whole strategy. It's really like a transformation of the dialectic when he turns from the Vietnam War, which he condemned, to the whole general, the universal condition of poverty in the United States, and was setting up action groups across the country among Chicanos, farm workers, the poor, the urban poor, and then came the Poor People's Campaign and the March on Washington. And after his assassination and the riots in Newark, where about 29 black people were killed by the state police when they were started to burn and loot some of the businesses in Newark. This is before Leroy Jones arrived, and Amir Baraka, I think he was called, and he had written Dutchman, and arrived in Newark to take a leadership role and organized the protests, and really is responsible for turning Newark into a very, very politically sensitive and progressive city. At any rate, Ralph Abernathy led the march on Washington. I took a train down, stayed with my friend who was editor of the foreign desk at the Washington Post, David and Marina Ottaway, and in their place in Washington, and they put me up. And main job I took on was to drive some of the people marching down to the reflecting pool. There was something like 150,000 people there, and they needed to get from 14th Street to that site near the Lincoln Memorial, and the Washington's, George Washington's monument, and I brought these people from 14th Street, and we marched into this near the reflecting pool. The state police were there. They did not harass us. It was a nonviolent, very much in the tradition of Gandhi, nonviolent demonstration, and it got tremendous national press. It was it sort of turned the tide, and then Abernathy went out to Los Angeles, and I went out there because my sister was living there, and I had a place to stay, and the great part of Los Angeles, which was downtown, near where the riots were. I went to all the speeches and got to know some of the main black leaders, and not soon after that they had a black mayor in Los Angeles, Bradley, I believe his name was, and it was a very, very intense and transformative time in America, and the Watts riots were very destructive and a little bit scary, but finally contained. And I was present there, and one of my friends, with whom I'd studied creative writing in a class taught by Monroe Engel at Harvard, was William Melvin Kelly, and I ran into him again at a party at a composer from Sierra Leone, Ingram Fox, gave in his house on the Riverside Drive overlooking the Hudson River. He was a very fine composer, and I was a friend of his, and he was very, very interested in me, and very, very warm, and invited me to parties there. At one of his parties, where his beautiful wife was present, I once took her to the New York Ballet, and Kelly came in, William Kelly. He had published Them, and another about a novel about black people in America just leaving, walking away from white America, from their black ghettos, and then anyway, he came in, and Malcolm X had just been assassinated. He claimed it was done by the CIA, and he had started. Bill Kelly had started going to Africa as a representative of the black Muslims, and he said it wasn't just the black Muslims from Chicago that were responsible, but in the church where he was murdered with machine guns, he claimed that it was CIA were responsible. I mean, I don't know any more about that issue of who was responsible than to say that, to quote his assertions. But he was going to Africa representing not the black Muslims, but an organization that he had founded, and he was a brilliant writer. I always listened to Bessie Smith when he wrote at Harvard, and then he, I don't know, I haven't read anything recently he's published, but he's a totally charismatic, inspiring. He and Rosanna Alfaro, Yamagiwa Alfaro, who won a summa cum laude in her senior thesis on Finnegan's Wake, with her advisor being Guy Davenport, was in that class. She wrote absolutely wonderful stories. She's written some wonderful plays recently, and become increasingly successful as the main force behind an Asian women's playwrights group, and present at all meetings. Her latest great success was at the Huntington Theater, which did one of her plays, brilliantly performed, and which I made a great effort to come back, especially from Europe, to attend that performance with my wife Pat, and who had been an actress and was very savvy about theatrical matters. And Kelly was in that class. I'm trying to think who else. It was I haven't heard much about Kelly since then. I mean, the main thing I did in the meantime is Pat and I and two other friends, Jan Schreiber, a poet, who had gotten his PhD from Brandeis, and Robert Kent, who had done his PhD work at University of Minnesota, up in Andover, with using the office where his father had printed real estate forms, and Robert kept this office as it was publishing these real estate forms, and was the managing editor of our literary quarterly called Cantrell Review of the Arts. I was fiction editor and book review editor. We did long book reviews, such as the New York Review, like the New York Review of Books, inspired by them. And we did 13 issues, 200 pages each. We had subscriptions, like about 144 subscriptions, and also in 14 countries. And raising money at that time was very difficult. I mean, I tried to get it from some of the Boston friends who were. We had a wonderful man, Altamir Whitehill, who was head of the Athenaeum and on our board. We had Clara Wainwright, who was a fabrics artist, brilliant woman who started the First Night Festival, and she did out of remnants, fabric remnants, she cut them and did these collages, brilliant work. And also Monroe Ingo and his wife Brenda were on our board. We had some wonderful party celebration at the Athenaeum, and where I'd invited Tim O'Brien and this wonderful writer who had written Stop Time, and Robert Stone, a novelist. And then we gave a party in a beauty salon where a friend of mine was having a big art exhibit. Then I arranged at the Signet Society, of which I was a member, a dinner. The president of the club was Elliot Richardson's son, John Richardson, and he was president of the Signet that year. We had a big dinner there, and through my friend William Alford, who was very close to Robert Lowell, he got Robert Lowell to come and read for nothing. And also, we had Arturo Vivante and Alan Grossman reading their works, and a poet named Samuel Monash, who wrote these very short, rather crisp and elegant poems. And he read, and after Alan Grossman read, and Lowell had already read, and it was a time when he really almost ruined the evening by reading too long, but he was a good poet. I can't say anything bad about him, but I mean, it's the kind of thing, in the vaudeville, they take their cane and they get them off the stage when they sort of are beginning to lose their audience. Anyway,
to be continued, Dad. To be continued. It's time to have a drink.
Yes, it was a wonderful evening. And while I was teaching at Milton Academy.
Stop. To be continued.
Yes, to be continued.